The dungeons in the Zelda series are highly regarded as one of the best features this franchise has to offer. These ambitious, maze-like structures are filled with a wide variety of puzzles and enemies, and navigating these spaces tend to be the highlight of every adventure. But what exactly goes into the design of these structures that make them so good? Obviously, not every dungeon in the series is perfect, but there are many of them that take huge strides in innovation and design to provide an experience unique about the rest. However, breaking down these elements for analysis is going to be no easy task. So today, we are being joined by NintendoBlackCrisis to analyze the design of these structures to figure out exactly what makes a good Zelda dungeon.
To start this off, we need to first establish the design formula that most of these dungeons abide by. Your typical Zelda dungeon usually consists of a series of puzzles or combat rooms connected within a maze-like layout. That is all bound together by a particular theme. This theme usually dictates many of the attributes about that said dungeon, such as the fire-based puzzles and enemies found in the Fire Temple, and the wind element present in the Wind Temple, just to name a few obvious ones. These dungeons are also home to a key item the player must obtain, collectibles scattered throughout, and are usually concluded by a final boss that typically matches the themes and motives of the past areas. But, with so many different attributes and layers that make up these dungeons, where exactly does one start when trying to analyze the design of these structures?
Fortunately, we can break down all the qualities of a set dungeon into three major categories: theme, structure, and challenges. The theme being the overarching feel or atmosphere that everything must fit under. The structure is how all the dungeon's various rooms bind together to influence the way that the place is traversed. And the challenges are all the smaller elements that fit inside the space, such as the enemies, puzzles, and collectibles. So, in order to figure out what makes a good Zelda dungeon, we need to break up this analysis piece by piece, starting with the theme.
Back in the original Zelda game, the concept of a dungeon theme was not quite established yet, as most of these dungeons just felt like a housing unit for some of the game's toughest enemies and challenges, while the actual space itself was quite bland, utilizing the same tile set and music as the last. As the technology got better and the series progressed, future dungeons would start to utilize unique atmospheres, enemies, and music that all fit under one set theme, which is still how most Zelda dungeons are created even till this day. These dungeon themes prevent the structures from feeling like a series of obstacles the player must overcome one by one, and instead feels like cohesive, meaningful spaces that tie in nicely with the game's overarching story or world. But within the dozens upon dozens of these dungeons within the series, making up a new and unique theme for every one is no easy task. But there are many diverse strategies the developers use to pull this off. One of the earliest and most straightforward strategies was to base the dungeon off a particular element, such as Ocarina of Time's Forest Temple, Water Temple, Shadow Temple, and so on. And as you could guess, each of those structures had its atmosphere and challenges built around that particular element. This was definitely one of the safest ways to develop a dungeon's theme. But as the series evolved, dungeon themes started to stray away from this simplicity, and instead offer a bit more story significance or plausibility to the world that it exists in. For an example, Twilight Princess's Arbiter Grounds was once a prison used to house Hyrule's most dangerous criminals while they awaited execution or exile, but has since been abandoned, now filled with mummies, skeletons, and other undead creatures that now roam the structure. Adding this layer of backstory or believability is definitely a huge step up from just a standard element change. And fortunately, many future Zelda dungeons did this as well. The Linearity mining facility was once used to mine up so many of the timeshift stones found within that region. Snow Peak Ruins is a snowy mansion owned by a group of Yetis that has since been corrupted, and so on.
However, I would have to say that some of the best dungeons are ones that introduce not one, but two interlocking themes that really make them stand out. Skyward Sword's Ancient Cistern is a great example of this, as it starts off in this serene, palace-like structure, only to be later contrasted by the dark and grueling underworld segment that lies beneath. And the combination of these themes gives the dungeon a unique heaven and hell-like aesthetic. In fact, many more of Skyward Sword's dungeons also do a great job with combining different themes as well, such as the sand ship and the mining facility, which switches between the past and the present via the use of timeshift technology, and the fire sanctuary, which features a really nice contrast between the dungeon's indoor and outdoor segments. However, I don't necessarily think that having some sort of unique theme interlocking or history is necessarily required for a dungeon's theme to be good, because as long as the game has different and unique themes for each dungeon, then that is perfectly fine by me. Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and The Wind Waker all for the most part did not contain any sort of deep, thematic elements besides just basic location and atmosphere differences, and these dungeon themes still turned out great. However, many of the dungeons in Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword definitely took an ambitious step up from this, and that is one of the main reasons why I find these games' dungeons a lot more memorable than the rest.
Despite this, there is only one Zelda game in recent time that happens to fall short in this regard, and that is Breath of the Wild. This game's dungeons, or divine beasts, don't really feature any unique or diverse themes, as all 4 of them stick true to the exact same architectural style and palette used by the rest. Each divine beast does feature different elementals based on the region that they are found in, such as the wind-based puzzles in the flying beast, and fire-based puzzles in the volcanic one. But the general lack of structural diversity is what really sets these dungeons apart from just about any other game in the series. However, there are still some things to appreciate about the style of the divine beasts, such as the fact that they have amazing looking exteriors that look great from even far away, which is a lot more interesting than the rest of the Zelda dungeons that are usually confined under the ground. This also makes the structures feel a lot more believable, along with the fact that these beasts play a key role in the game's story and lore, which is something that the divine beasts do a way better job at than just about any other dungeon in the series. But overall, I would still have to admit that the classic dungeons did a way better job with conveying themes that were both diverse and memorable, and hopefully the future Zelda games will go back to using that approach.
Moving on, the next major point that we need to discuss about these dungeons is their structure and progression. As we know, dungeons are made up of series of combat and puzzle rooms interlocked within a maze-like structure. But how exactly are these rooms assembled or organized to create one progressive flow? This is where 2 major terms come into play, and I'm sure you've heard them before, and they are linear and non-linear design. A linear dungeon refers to a structure with one critical path, where all the challenges usually line up in a linear fashion until you get to the end, and a non-linear dungeon usually refers to one that doesn't have a clear critical path, and often involves the use of open-ended discovery and branching paths. Before I get into the ups and downs of each style of dungeon, I first need to establish that defining every single dungeon in the Zelda series as either linear or non-linear is too much of a generalization, as many of the dungeons contain both linear and non-linear elements. Instead, we must think of the concept of linearity as a spectrum, to see what dungeons have a higher or lower ratio of these 2 design elements. If we were to generalize, most of the dungeons in games like Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, and the other 3D games tend to be on the linear side. A lot of the older 2D Zelda games like A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening tend to be in the middle, and on the far right would be Breath of the Wild's Divine Beasts. With that said, let's break down the design formulas of each of these areas, starting with the far linear side.
It may come as a surprise when I say that linear dungeons are the most common type of dungeon out there, as the majority of them don't necessarily feel this way. There are a few dungeons that people would definitely categorize as linear right off the bat, such as Ocarina of Time's Shadow Temple and Twilight Princess's Temple of Time, as you quite literally move in a straight path throughout these dungeons. However, most of the other 3D Zelda dungeons are actually very linear as well. They just have a better way of tricking you into believing that it is more open. One of the biggest ways a dungeon can do this is by introducing a large central room that the player must return to and crisscross over many times. Arbiter's Grounds is a great example of this, as its central room makes everything seem more open and cohesive. But in reality, this whole dungeon only contains one critical path throughout. But the overlapping is what tricks the player into thinking it's not linear. Some other strategies that these dungeons utilize to feel more non-linear is by having larger rooms with less door partitions, making the critical path harder to find, and containing backtracking, which is something we will have to backtrack to a little later. Because there is one question that we probably have to answer first before moving on. What is the point of making a linear dungeon that feels non-linear, instead of just making a non-linear dungeon?
The answer to that question is that linear dungeons can present challenges and obstacles in a tailor-made order that can evolve over the course of a dungeon. Let's take Skyward Sword's Skyview Temple for an example, which in one of the very first rooms features a large eyeball puzzle that the player must solve in order to progress. Then later in the dungeon, there is another eyeball-based puzzle, but now with 2 eyes. And then again, near the very end of the dungeon, there is a final eyeball puzzle that deals with 3 of these eyes at the same time. These puzzles work very well together because of how the linear nature of the dungeon sets them up to be one after the other, so the ramp up in challenge is quite nice. However, let's imagine that this temple had a completely non-linear structure instead. A player could technically visit the room with the 3 eyeballs before the other 2 rooms, and be completely confused on what to do, as the easier versions of that puzzle meant to train the player were completely bypassed due to the non-linearity. This is what makes the linear dungeons so great, as they are allowed to have these great, evolving challenges that wouldn't work in the non-linear ones, but still often contain elements of the hidden linearity that was talked about earlier to make the player feel smarter about navigating its space. However, these evolving challenges only became a prominent feature in the dungeon starting with Wind Waker, and was never really seen in games like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. So what strategy did most of these past linear dungeons rely on to still make their navigation interesting?
The answer to that would be backtracking, but not necessarily the bad kind, like unnecessarily slogging through past segments to milk the length of a dungeon, but more so the kind that requires the player to take notes and be observant of all areas that are currently inaccessible with your current arsenal, but might be if something is accomplished later on. Ocarina of Time's Fire Temple, for an example, features this oddly placed stone pillar right near the entrance that cannot be interacted with in any way. But after obtaining the dungeon's key item, the Megaton Hammer, there are many statues in the rooms to follow that the player can now destroy with the hammer to progress. But in order to actually beat the dungeon, the player will eventually have to make the connection between the statue in the first room and the ones he is currently encountering now, and backtrack there to unlock one of the dungeon's final rooms. This rewards a player who is keen and observant about progressing through a dungeon, rather than just slogging through it. And that's why backtracking done right is one of the best tactics a dungeon can utilize.
So, now that we know that games like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask utilize backtracking to make their linear dungeons more interesting, what exactly happened to this design strategy when games like Wind Waker came out? Unfortunately, backtracking, for the most part, would be thrown out the window, at least in the classic sense. Obviously, there would still be times in these dungeons where you would have to return to the past rooms, but you did so because the path of the dungeon literally led you to go back there, not because you made the conscious choice to do so. In just about every single one of Wind Waker's dungeons, as soon as you get the dungeon's critical item, you are immediately led directly to the past room where you need to use it. Unlike many of the dungeons in Ocarina of Time, where you actually need to remember where to use the critical item after obtaining it. With the Wind Waker, you can forget about making smart decisions or taking notes, because the dungeons are quite literally just guiding you through them.
Although Wind Waker was the game that started the whole evolving challenges thing that was stated earlier, this game still easily has some of the most boring to navigate dungeons just because of their straightforward, hand-holdy structure. Future games, however, would get better at this, like Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword offering some backtracking segments on top of the puzzle motifs and hidden linearity. But even some of those dungeons are too scared to let the player venture out and make connections of their own. I feel like we have talked enough about the linear structure in the 5 original 3D Zelda games. So what about the open structure in the most recent 3D game, Breath of the Wild?
Well, in a lot of ways, Breath of the Wild's Divine Beasts are just about the opposite of what we would normally expect from the linear dungeons in the past games. Since 90% of the dungeon's objectives can be completed in any order, this gives the Divine Beasts a lot more of an open, refreshing feel that in a way is a nice break from the linear dungeons of the past games. However, this also means that none of the dungeon's puzzles can build off of each other or be connected in any way, because each one has to assume that this could be your very first. On top of that, the dungeons themselves are extremely small, only really containing 7 main objectives apiece, which makes these some of the shortest dungeons in series history. With all the negative things I've been saying about these structures in this video, you may be under the impression that I hate them, which is not really the case at all, because there is one really great thing in terms of the Divine Beast structures that make them stand out from the rest, and that is, they move. Whether that be rotating the 3 giant chambers in the middle of a beast, or flipping one on a 90-degree angle, each one of these beasts can be manipulated at your own free will to not only navigate the dungeon, but also to solve many of its puzzles. Simply fumbling with the switch won't get you very far in one of these places, and instead, a player must understand the relationship between the dungeon's architecture and its movement in order to overcome these challenges. This aspect, in my opinion, is one of the biggest things that makes Breath of the Wild's dungeons stand out, But there is in fact one other game that has these design elements strongly present within its dungeons, and that is Majora's Mask. In just about every single one of these dungeons, the player must understand the relationship between the dungeon's architecture and its key altering force in order to progress within. Whether that be Snowhead Temple and its giant breakable pillar, Great Bay Temple and its ever-changing water currents, or even the Stone Tower Temple with its ability to flip upside down, trying to figure out the route forward by aimlessly backtracking through it won't get you very far at all, and the only way to progress forward is to figure out and understand the dungeon's key mechanism. Unfortunately though, Majora's Mask and Breath of the Wild are the only games that prominently utilize this design strategy within the dungeons, and if you're lucky, maybe you will see one or even two dungeons like this in the other games, like the Water Temple, Lakebed Temple, and the Sand Ship, just to name a few. I'm glad that Breath of the Wild went back to using this design strategy, because dungeons like this are easily some of the most interesting ones in Zelda history.
But now that we have talked a lot about the structure and theme of the dungeons, what about the actual contents within them? The enemies, puzzles, collectibles, even bosses? Earlier in the video, we discussed how a dungeon should follow a set theme, like how a volcanic-based temple should have puzzles and enemies based around fire and lava, or an underworld-based temple pertaining to undead things, and so on. We have also discussed how a dungeon's structural design should influence the way content is presented to the player, such as the evolution in puzzles in places like Skyview Temple. So, to be honest, we have indirectly covered a lot of things about the dungeon's actual content, but there are still a few great points to bring up. Since every dungeon is vastly different in the variety of puzzles, enemies, and situations, we'll have to generalize here by talking about key things in common between them all. And the first thing we should probably analyze are the dungeon items.
In every dungeon, roughly around the halfway point, the player is usually given some form of new item that not only blends in well with the theme of the dungeon, but also opens up new areas to the dungeon that the player might not have been able to explore without it. And for the most part, I would have to say that most of the items get some really creative use throughout these dungeons. Whether that be riding the spinner rails in Arbiter's grounds, or using a dust cannon to move windmill switches in the Linearity mining facility, there aren't many items in the series that ever feel dull or uninspired in this regard. However, I feel that some of the best dungeon items are ones that not only see just one main use throughout these dungeons, but rather multiple. Let's take the Gale Boomerang for an example, which not only functions as a standard boomerang to cut down ropes and vines, but it can also be used for putting out fires, spinning windmill switches, grappling up items, and so many other creative uses that can be all done in the dungeon that it's obtained in.
Another quality a lot of great dungeon items possess is the ability to solve challenges more efficiently than you could with your past arsenal. Take the Peahats in Wind Waker's Forbidden Woods for an example, which at first are slow to kill, are now made easy when obtaining the dungeon's boomerang, which can finish them off instantly. Same thing with the large ice boulders in Twilight Princess's Snow Peak Ruins, which previously required the use of a stationary cannon and cannonball to destroy, but can now be easily taken care of when obtaining the dungeon's key item. However, there still are a lot of dungeons that contain items that feel rather unexciting to use, and really don't serve that big of a purpose throughout the dungeon, like the hover boots within the Shadow Temple. But despite a few of those negative outliers, I really do enjoy the concept of dungeon items that the series has been staying consistent with, as they give the dungeons another layer of character to help them stand out. But what about the one game that doesn't even contain dungeon items at all?
Well, first off, one of the main reasons why these dungeons cannot contain items is because it will completely restrict the game's open world flow. Since Breath of the Wild's dungeons can be completed in any order, the game has to assume that any one of these dungeons can be the player's first dungeon experience ever. Therefore, all the tools necessary to complete these dungeons need to be accessible before it can even be entered. In this case, all of the runes obtained back on the Great Plateau. And since most of the dungeon items in the Zelda series are commonly utilized in the dungeons that follow it, Breath of the Wild cannot have items like the other games unless each one was thrown out after the dungeon that it was obtained in. So how exactly does Breath of the Wild's dungeons hold up without them?
Quite well, actually. Given how diverse Link's base toolset is in Breath of the Wild compared to other games, there are so many possibilities within Link's arsenal of runes and even the Divine Beast controls we talked about earlier that allow the player to solve puzzles in quite unique ways. Most of the puzzles within this beast can be completed in more ways than just one, which is a clean break from the past games in the series, where just about every single puzzle or encounter had a single set solution. With how many times the past vast dungeons discouraged out-of-the-box thinking to solve many of the structural challenges? The sandbox nature of Breath of the Wild is one of the main things that helps its puzzle solving stand out.
But putting the items and puzzle solving aside though, let's talk about another one of these dungeons' most iconic features, the final boss fight. These fights act as your final test in completing a particular dungeon, and usually provide an engaging way of tying off the ongoing themes and motifs of the dungeon. However, one of my biggest gripes about a lot of the bosses in these dungeons is that they sometimes don't feel like much of a challenge at all. Games like The Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword all suffer from this issue, as most of these bosses' movesets are rather predictable, and the pattern to attack them is made quite clear, commonly utilizing a basic functionality of the dungeon's key item to take them down. This may be fine in some of the earlier dungeons of a particular game, but I was really hoping that some of the late game boss battles will pose a bit more of a threat, like how they did back in Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. However, I don't think that the difficulty makes some bad fights at all, because most of them still look quite good on the visual end, and they are accompanied by some awesome pieces of music. The only game that didn't really have the most appealing boss fights in my opinion was Breath of the Wild, and this mainly has to deal once again with their theme, because just like the divine beasts that they exist in, they all basically look the exact same. When it comes to the fights themselves, they weren't terrible, but the majority of them can easily be cheesed by using bullet time and a bunch of arrows, except for Thunderblight, who still proves to be one of the most daunting and frantic Zelda bosses even to this day.
There is one more minor thing we should analyze about the dungeons, and that is their optional collectibles. I'm not talking about the occasional rupee chests that are scattered throughout, but rather the more exclusive items such as heart pieces, gold sculptulas, and the stray fairies. The existence of important items like these incentivize the player to really take a closer look when navigating these spaces, and some games do a great job when it comes to balancing collectibles in the dungeons themselves. A great example is Majora's Mask's Stray Fairies, where every single dungeon contains exactly 15 of these things. And although they can be easily missed over, a keen player who manages to collect them all will be met with some of the greatest rewards in the entire game, such as an extended magic meter, or a giant two-handed sword that deals a ton of damage. This is a lot better than how other games like Ocarina of Time handle collectibles, as the player has absolutely no clue how many collectibles or what sort of collectibles can be found in a particular dungeon, and it's just a matter of exploring every nook and cranny of the structure. The dungeons in Twilight Princess definitely do a better job at this, as every single dungeon in this game contains exactly 2 heart pieces, no more or no less. Which would actually be really helpful if the game directly told you this information from the start. But sadly, most players don't even realize this pattern existed until they have almost completed the game. Luckily, all of the heart pieces found in the dungeons are marked on your map as soon as you obtain the compass, which makes them a lot more manageable to find, unlike the unpredictable locations of collectibles like the gold sculptulas.
But with all this said, what exactly makes a good Zelda dungeon? Now that we have finally broken down the theme, structure, and challenge elements of these dungeons, it is now time to reanalyze each of these categories to answer our question. A good Zelda dungeon is one that utilizes a unique theme that not only helps bind all the elements of the dungeon together, but also helps it stand out from the rest of the dungeons in that game. Some of the best ones are ones that contribute to a larger story, history, or having some other hidden meaning behind it that give these dungeons more purpose in the world.
A good Zelda dungeon should also have a layout that is both interesting and thought-provoking to navigate, complete with dungeon-altering mechanisms and backtracking that establish these spaces as one cohesive unit, rather than a series of separate challenge rooms a player must overcome in an obvious linear order.
And finally, a good Zelda dungeon is one that contains ideas that evolve throughout the course of it, that work very well within the dungeon's overarching theme from the moment that you walk into it to the very final boss fights. But with all this information in mind, which Zelda games can we say for sure had the very best dungeons in the series? This question definitely provokes a very subjective answer, but the games that I feel like did the best jobs at lining up with the analysis of this video have got to be Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword. Although none of these games have dungeons that perfectly fit all the good qualities that we have talked about in this video, most of these dungeons utilize great examples of structural and thematic design to create easily some of the most memorable places in the series. On the flip side, it would be wrong to say that there are Zelda dungeons with bad game design, but my definite least favorite dungeons in the 3D games have to be from Wind Waker and Breath of the Wild, which is definitely in an odd place, considering it contains both some of the best and worst elements of dungeon design we have yet seen in a Zelda game. However, this is definitely subjective, and there is no shame in liking the dungeons in games like the Wind Waker, because after all, just about every single Zelda dungeon is fun in one way or another. But throughout a dungeon's diverse and memorable theme, thought-provoking layout, and many engaging challenges alike, I can safely say that these are the most prominent attributes of a good Zelda dungeon. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching. A special shout out to NintendoBlackCrisis for collaborating with me on this one. Definitely feel free to check out his channel and subscribe there for more Zelda videos like this one. We have also done some other collaboration videos in the past, such as a theory about Ganon's resurrection cycle on my channel, and a theory about the ancient Sheikah technology on his. I'll leave a link to both of these videos along with his channel link down in the description below, so be sure to check it out and subscribe there if you haven't done so already. Also, if you could like this video and subscribe here as well, that would definitely help my channel out a lot. And finally, a special shout out to my amazing patrons and YouTube members who help support the channel. I'll leave a link down in the description below if you would like to help me out here as well. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.